Excellencies, honorable delegates, may the peace and blessings of God be upon you. The 24th of October of every year is the UN Day, and it allows us the chance to highlight the role of the United Nations throughout its history regarding the Palestine issue. Played also today within a wider context of an Israeli aggression on civilians in Gaza. The Arab Center is honored to host this seminar with the participation of some very well-known UN scholars and experts. And we shall inaugurate this session with Dr. Michael Lynk, whom I will introduce in his language, in English. إذن هو أستاذ فخري في كلية الحقوق في جامعة وستر في أونتاريو في كندا، حيث درس مواد تتعلق بقانون العمل وقانون حقوق الإنسان والإعاقة. ومن 2019 ل 2022 كان المقرر الخاص للأمم المتحدة بالنسبة إلى حقوق الإنسان في الأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة منذ 67. وفي مارس 2022 رفع إلى مجلس حقوق الإنسان في الأمم المتحدة أول تقرير خلص إلى أن إسرائيل قد مأسست نظام الفصل العنصري في الأراضي المحتلة. كذلك لطالما دعا إلى عقوبات اقتصادية على دولة إسرائيل من أجل إلزامها وإجبارها بإنهاء احتلالها غير المشروع. اليوم سوف يناقش موضوع قضية فلسطين كأدلة على أن القانون الدولي أقرب إلى السلطة من العدالة وكيف يمكن معالجة هذا الموضوع. تفضل حضرة البروفيسور. شكرا جزيلا على هذه المقدمة. شكرا جزيلا لمعهد دوحة والمركز العربي من أجل أو لدعوتي أتحدث إليكم. هذا أول زيارة لي إلى مدينة الدوحة في دولة قطر، وطبعا لقد أثار ما رأيته انطباعي، واسم دولة قطر ذكر أكثر من مرة في الأيام الأخيرة فيما يتعلق بالدبلوماسية.
To the current assault by Israel on Gaza. Qatar obviously is a country that, as we would say in the West, punches far above its weight. What I want to do today in my brief remarks is to discuss in a very abbreviated fashion the role of the United Nations with respect to the question of Palestine, and to talk about this always tight tension between the international rule of law and the international rule by law, because I think that helps us understand why it is that we have so many UN resolutions, so much clear-cut law on occupation, the rules of war, and on human rights, and yet so many of them seem to be sidelined when it comes to the question of Palestine. I first want to commend to you, as I begin my brief presentation, a quote from the very eloquent memoirs of former Secretary General Kofi Annan. His book, Interventions, written in 2012, is an eloquent overview of his time as Secretary General. I commend him to you all. What he said in his chapter on the Middle East was this. He said, "I believe the failure to achieve an Arab-Israeli peace is the core source of frustration and instability in the region. This failure also remains for the United Nations a deep internal wound as old as the organization itself, given that the Arab-Israeli conflict began at the very inception of the United Nations, a painful and festering sore consequently felt in almost every intergovernmental organ and secretariat body. As I told the Security Council before I left office in 2006, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not simply one unresolved problem among many. No other issue," he said, "carries such a powerful symbolic and emotional charge affecting people far from the zone of conflict." And that led me, in one of my reports, to be able to comment on this vast disparity, this great abyss between international law and international power, and the way, in particular, it is reflected in the, during the occupation. And I said in one of my reports, and I won't be quoting throughout my report, my presentation to you, but I do want to put this on the table in front of you. I said, no occupation in the modern world has been conducted with the international community so alert to its many grave breaches of international law, so knowledgeable about the occupiers' obvious and well-signaled intent to annex and establish permanent sovereignty, so well informed about the scale of suffering and dispossession endured by the protected population under occupation, and yet so unwilling to act upon the overwhelming evidence before it to use the tangible and plentiful legal and political tools at its disposal to end this injustice. During my 6 years as Special Rapporteur, I focused obviously on international law, assuming and hoping that in the corridors of power and in diplomacy, there were those who would listen to an argument that was built at its core on international law and human rights. And they would be swayed by the countless numbers of UN resolutions that they themselves had either voted for or they themselves had committed themselves to follow. But what I learned in those 6 years was that in difficult human rights crises, and this is nowhere more apparent than in the question of Palestine, international law is closer to power than it is to justice. Because keep in mind, international law was never meant to be an umbrella that folds up at the first sign of rain. There's always been, as I mentioned, this acute tension between the international rule of law, which embodies the principles of justice, human dignity, and equality for all, and the international rule by law, which is the principles of realpolitik, where power centers act to try to defend their interests, notwithstanding what international law would say, notwithstanding the commitments they've made through UN resolutions. This is the way I think, and I urge you to reflect upon this, this is the way I think we have to think about how international law has played itself out when it comes to the history of Palestine over the past 75 years and more. Keep this in mind. There is always going to be this struggle between the forces of power and the forces of justice in the creation of UN resolutions, of laws, of international conventions and treaties on the issue of rights. And even after conventions or treaties or laws have been adopted, and it seems as if these advancing forces interested in justice and equality and human dignity have succeeded, the struggle is by no means over. Resolutions, as we have all seen too often, can be sidelined or ignored. Treaties can be given implausibly narrow interpretations by powers that be, and conventions can be declared to be advisory only and not binding. The interests of power are not without their own tools of cunning and creativity and imagination in trying to escape their obligations. So let me turn now to the question of Palestine. And I'm going to choose, in the interest of time and efficiency, four dates that I think are important for us to understand. It may not be the conventional dates that you yourselves have listened, have heard about before, or have read about, or indeed taught in your many lectures and seminars. The first important date I'm going to choose is 1947. And that obviously was the first major consequential decision made by the fledgling United Nations. It was the first important crisis that was faced by the new United Nations, and it is quite arguably the very first major mistake made by the new United Nations. And this comes from research that I'm doing myself. I'm planning to write a book on the decision of the United Nations in the question of Palestine and the decision to partition Palestine in 1947. I'm partway through that research now, and I hope to spend most of next year writing the book with respect to that. Some of you may have heard of the name Brian Urquhart. He was the Undersecretary General of the United Nations for a number of years, and a highly literate and prolific author who wrote a number of books on his experiences in the United Nations. He said in his memoirs that the Palestine problem has haunted the development of the United Nations ever since 1948. I would suggest you should start at 1947. The United Nations' involvement in Palestine, he lamented in one of his books, has twisted the organization's image and fragmented its reputation and prestige as no other issue has. Three very brief points to make about 1947. In the summer of 1947, the UN General Assembly created the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, UNSCOP. And this is in the aftermath of Great Britain deciding to leave its mandate and to turn the issue of what to do and what the future of Palestine was going to be into the hands of the General Assembly. And the first important thing to understand about UNSCOP and the decision-making that was made that culminated in the decision to partition Palestine was that of the 11 members of the UNSCOP Commission in the summer of 1947, they came from either Europe, from countries that had built empires or were close to that. Two of the members came from British Commonwealth countries, in other words, countries that they themselves were settler colonies, Canada and Australia. Three of them came from Latin America and were represented by those from the small Spanish-descended elite that ruled those countries in those years, from Guatemala, Peru, and Uruguay, and also two countries from southern Asia. The report that UNSCOP came up with at the end of August 1947 to send back to the United Nations, a majority of them recommended partition, and a minority, 3 countries, recommended a single state that would be bound to recognize both the rights of the 34% of the population that was migrant European Jews, the majority while also recognizing the rights of the indigenous Palestinian Arabs who were there. Intriguingly, the 3 members of the commission who voted against partition and wanted to see some form of singular unitary state in Palestine we came from countries that either had a significant or a majority Muslim population: Yugoslavia, Iran, and India. In its detailed coverage of the UNSCOP report, which later became the basis for the November 1947 partition of Palestine, the Economist magazine in early September 1947 called the majority plan by the UNSCOP Commission both unjust and unworkable. Why? They noted that the Commission, that the UNSCOP report would have given 62% of Mandate Palestine to the 34% of the population, the Palestinian Jews, most of them who were immigrants. They would have been given almost 2/3 of the land area of Palestine, both of its ports, most of its primary water sources, and most of its valuable citrus plantations. At the time, the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, had only owned about 7% of the land in Palestine. Almost all of the Palestine's industries, either Arab or Jewish or international, would be in the new Jewish state. And yet, even this new Jewish state would be just about equal in terms of population between European Jews and Palestinian Arabs. It was an unworkable plan as well as being an immensely unfair plan, and yet with variations on that, that became the basis of the vote in 1947, in November 1947, to partition Palestine in two. Partition was already having a difficult name by 1947. Remember, the other great partition of that year occurred in the Asian subcontinent, with the division between Pakistan and India. And later we would understand, I guess, an historical reflection, that partition is usually an imperial response to an imperial-created problem. The second date I want to bring to your attention then, as a key cornerstone of the development of the United Nations with respect to Palestine, is 1980. And in June of 1980, the UN Security Council passed, with an American abstention, Resolution 476. Resolution 476 did three important things. First of all, it reaffirmed the principle already established 13 years before in the cornerstone Resolution 242. It reaffirms that the acquisition of territory by force or by war is inadmissible. This is a cornerstone of the post-Second World War order, that countries cannot expand their borders by war or by force. And this was a direct comment on the annexation by Israel of East Jerusalem and parts of the West Bank, initially in 1967, then confirmed by a Knesset vote in June of 1980. The second thing that Resolution 476 did, and I would quote, it reaffirms the overriding necessity, mark my words that I'm quoting, the overriding necessity for ending the prolonged occupation of Arab territories occupied since 1967. So the UN Security Council already, only 13 years into the occupation, was talking about the occupation being prolonged and the overriding necessity of bringing it to an immediate end. And the third thing that was said in Resolution 476, adopted by the Security Council, and I'll quote again, it strongly deplores the continued refusal of Israel, the occupying power, to comply with the relevant resolutions of the Security Council and the General Assembly. Already, the Security Council was saying that Israel has been and is a bad faith occupier of the Palestinian territories under occupation for the previous 13 years. Keep in mind that if the United Nations had acted upon that in 1980, 13 years into the occupation, it would have had a much easier time in being able to ensure a genuine two-state solution between Israel and Palestine. At the time, the settler population in East Jerusalem was under 100,000 in 1980 at the time of this vote. In the West Bank, it was 10,000. And in Gaza, there were about 2,500 settlers. So all told, there roughly were about 115,000 Israeli settlers in 1980. The possibilities of putting that into force were so much greater than there is now. My third important date for you is 2008 and 2009. Those of you with memories of this from 15 years ago will know that was the first major military assault on Gaza by Israel, beginning on December 27th and ending roughly 35 to 40 days later in late January 2009. What I want to point out to you was that this is also the first time that the United Nations Human Rights Council initiated a major international impartial study in the aftermath of this assault, the so-called Richard Goldstone report of that time. And this wound up creating two things that I want to bring to your attention. First of all, the Goldstone report that was issued 8 months after the end of the Israeli assault, it found with convincing evidence that the armed, and I'll quote to you, the Israeli armed forces in Gaza had committed willful killing, torture, or inhumane treatment, willfully causing great suffering or serious injury to body or health, and extensive documentation of destruction of property, not justified by military necessity and carried out unlawfully and unwarrantedly. As grave breaches, these acts give rise to individual criminal responsibility. The mission notes that the use of human shields by Israel also creates a war crime under the Rome Statute. And it also made what I thought was an extraordinary plea with respect to the issue of immunity, impunity, and the lack of accountability. The Goldstone report stated at the end, and please listen to this, it said, "The prolonged situation of impunity has created a justice crisis in the occupied Palestinian territory that warrants action." Sad to say that nothing became of that report. Indeed, there was a second substantial report commissioned by the UN Human Rights Council in the aftermath of the major, even greater assault on Gaza in 2014. And there was yet a third report that was commissioned and released by the UN Human Rights Council after the Great March of Return after 2018. Each of those three reports found the issues of grave breaches of international law and possibly war crimes being committed by Hamas, but also, and more predominantly, by Israel. Each of those three reports has sat on some UN desk and continued to collect dust. The fourth report that I want to bring to your, the fourth time zone that I want to bring to your attention has to do with 2016. And in December 2016, at the very end, in the last couple of weeks of the Barack Obama administration, the question arose about a vote or a resolution being proposed with respect to the Israeli settlements. There had not been a UN resolution at the Security Council at that time passed critical of Israel since Resolution 1860 in January 2009. And it looked like for a moment that the Obama regime, all 8 years of it, would be the first American administration never to allow a resolution at the Security Council critical of Israel. So this came about, and I won't take you through the machinations and immense, intense negotiations that wound up leading to it. But again, there are several important points that I want to bring to your attention. This resolution passed 14 votes in favor, none against, with the U.S. abstaining. Again, it issued, to repeat, the inadmissibility principle, that the acquisition of territory by war or by force is inadmissible, referring again to Israel's de jure annexation of East Jerusalem and parts of the West Bank, but also, I think, referring implicitly to the ongoing de facto annexation of Palestinian territory in the West Bank. The second thing that it did was that it called the settlements illegal, but not only that, it said they were a flagrant violation of international law. It's rare to find the unanimity in the Security Council to be able to use that kind of harsh and demanding language, particularly with respect to the fact that there was and continues to be a close alliance between the United States and Israel. But flagrant violation of international law is indeed the wording that was used there. It demanded the immediate halt to settlement activity, and also asked the Secretary General to make a report every 3 months to the Security Council on Israel's compliance with this demand that it immediately stop all settlement activity. At that time, in 2016, there were approximately 400,000 settlers in the West Bank and a little over 200,000 settlers in East Jerusalem. Since then, there has been 27 reports every 3 months, 27 reports given by the Secretary General or by the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process to the Security Council on the implementation or non-implementation of Resolution 2334 with respect to the settlements. And each of those 27 reports given quarterly to the Security Council, the Secretary General or the Special Coordinator has said there has been no activity by Israel to halt settlement construction. And indeed, this year, it was reported in March of 2023 by the Washington Post that the number of settlers now in the West Bank has reached 500,000. So in the 7 years, in the 6+ years, it has expanded by roughly 20,000 settlers a year. And as one WAG once had pointed out, what person cannot do their arithmetic and realize that building, increasing settlers at the rate of 20 to 25,000 a year means no Palestinian state with respect to this. And I must quickly then point, because I'm running out of time here, that the main obstacle to all of this rests with the United States. In his memoirs that I quoted earlier, Kofi Annan pointed out that even when the Security Council did take positions, it did not establish mechanisms to enforce its will. The United States wielded its veto to protect the Israelis even from reasonable international scrutiny and pressure, paralyzing the Council on one of the world's central conflicts with respect to this. And if I can just briefly point to this, because this will then lead into my comments with respect to Gaza. Since 1973, in the last 50 years, my count, and this may be off by 1 or 2, but it's fairly accurate, the United States has cast 82 vetoes at the Security Council, which is far more than any other of the other 4 permanent members. Of these 82 vetoes, 43 of them have been used by the United States to scuttle resolutions critical of Israel. 10 of them had to do with resolutions that had been critical of Israel's invasion and occupation of Lebanon. The other 33 have dealt with the would have dealt with the Israeli occupation of Palestine. And in his very, I think, insightful memoirs that were published 3 years ago, Barack Obama said, just about every country in the world considered Israel's continuing occupation of the Palestinian territories to be a violation of international law. As a result, our diplomats found themselves in the awkward position of having to defend Israel for actions that we ourselves opposed. And that 43rd resolution that was vetoed by the United States, of course, came a week ago, last Wednesday, when the United States alone vetoed a resolution calling for a humanitarian ceasefire, not a permanent ceasefire, but a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. 12 countries had voted for that resolution. 2, Russia and the United Kingdom abstained, and the United States alone issued the veto. And the veto obviously has the effect of wanting to continue the Israeli assault on Gaza, to prolong the agony, to increase the bloodshed, and to make Gaza even more uninhabitable than it has become. I remind you that in 2012 and again in 2017, the UN country team in the occupied Palestinian territory said that Gaza would become unlivable by 2020. And nothing in the trajectory from 2012 and 2017 have altered that course with respect to Gaza. Gaza, with an unemployment rate between 45 and 50% before October 7th, already the highest unemployment rate of any economic unit that the World Bank winds up measuring. Gaza, with its healthcare system flat on its back, unable to import even any type of modern healthcare equipment to be able to service the population of 2.3 million Palestinians there. Gaza with undrinkable water, with 97% of its coastal aquifer contaminated by either seawater or by sewage. Gaza, which in 2016, the then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said that it was that Israel's blockade of Gaza, already at that time only 10 years long, already had amounted to collective punishment. That is the conclusion I reached myself in 2020 in one of my later reports as special rapporteur. And collective punishment, I should remind you, is a breach, a profound breach of the Fourth Geneva Convention of Article 33. What's happened since October 7th is immeasurably worse. What was already up to October 7th, a humanitarian crisis that should have been on the conscience of the world, that because there was no other place, tell me another place in the world where there is more than 2 million people penned up behind a comprehensive land, sea, and air blockade, unable to leave, unable to enter, and people unable to be able to leave from this. Fundamental violation of a fundamental right of fundamental human right of freedom of movement. Since October 7th, of course, we've seen the complete cutoff of water, food, fodder for animal feed, of power, and of fuel to be able to run generators. The movement of around 500,000 people from the north to the south. International law very clearly prohibits the use of starvation as a military tool in a military conflict against the civilian population. It also forbids absolutely the denial of the necessities of life to a civilian population caught in a war zone. Where I come from, in Canada, in North America, yes, there's condemnation, as there should be, with respect to the murders of Israeli civilians by Hamas on October 7th and the shooting of rockets into civilian areas and the capture of civilian hostages. These are all violations of international law. I preach international law because it is the one common measuring stick that we can all use to judge our actions by. And they apply to, either they apply to everybody or they apply to nobody. International human rights law, international humanitarian law, international criminal law applies to every single one of us. It's not recommendations. These are not flexible options. These are not soft law. These are mandatory provisions that every country that's signed onto them, and every country in the world has signed onto the Fourth Geneva Convention, which is the beating heart of international humanitarian law. These are profound obligations that individual countries make as a promise to one another and to their citizens that they will wind up obeying this. If I can then just end off with this. I learned very early on when I was special rapporteur that it was very easy to give a lecture of 20 minutes or half an hour or 40 minutes of doom, of breaches, of bad faith, of violations. And I felt at the end that you, the audience, all you wanted to do was to slit your wrist. And that seems to me an unfair way to be able to end this off. I should always try to find bridges of hope and optimism, because I am by nature, as a lawyer, as an international lawyer, optimistic that those forces wanting to see the implementation of international law will overcome those centers of power that want to see them downgraded or ignored whatsoever. But any peace that's going to come and any peace process that's going to be successful has to follow, I think, these 5 rules, and I'll say them to you very briefly. Number 1, because of the vast asymmetry of power between Israel and the Palestinians, active international intervention is indispensable. it is fruitless to keep on saying the two parties should go back to the negotiating table and decide things for themselves when militarily, economically, diplomatically, territorially, Israel has so many more advantages over the Palestinians. The only advantage that the Palestinians have is demographics. There are now 7 million Israeli Jews that live between the river and the sea, and 7 million Palestinian Arabs that live between the river and the sea. They're not going anywhere, and the Palestinians now, it appears, already have a slight demographic majority over the Israeli Jews. Number two, the framework for fully ending the occupation and for fully ending conflicts like this must employ a rights-based approach based on international law and human rights. What has made a mess over the last 30 years of the Oslo process is that it was always founded on realpolitik, on the strength of one party versus the weakness of the other. And that has ensured the endless failures of the Oslo process, the roadmap, the Annapolis framework, the John Kerry initiative, not to speak of, if we should speak of at all, the Trump Peace to Prosperity plan. Only a rights-based approach can engage the considerable tools of accountability and international law to end impunity and advance the interests of both Israelis and Palestinians. Number three, the end goal has to be the realization of genuine Palestinian self-determination. And that can either be in two states or it could be in one democratic state. It seems to me that in many ways the future for a two-state solution is fading and fading fast. Number four, it has to be accepted, and this has to be an argument made by people like you with respect to Europe and North America. Israel is a bad faith occupier. This is the inescapable conclusion from its conduct of its 56-year-old occupation with respect to this. To assume that Israel is a responsible occupier, marred only by an unfortunate and errant policy towards the Palestinians, is to engage in the magical thinking that has led to the failure of all past diplomatic failures. And number five, the occupation must end with all deliberate speed. Alien rule in the 21st century can only be justified in exceptional and highly conditioned circumstances. Modern international law and effective international statecraft do not tolerate an indefinite clock for injustice to end, particularly for an avaricious occupation that has long since slipped the restraining bonds of legitimacy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Lynk, for sharing your insights on the hegemony of the lack of the implementation of international law when it comes to Palestine. So we'll move to the second speaker, Dr. Abdelhamid Siyam, المتحدث الثاني في هذه الندوة.
Speaker in this seminar. We will introduce quickly Dr. Siyam. He is a professor in Rutgers University in political science in New Jersey University since 2007. Worked before that as an international employee in the United Nations for 25 years, where he in charge of many positions in the office of the Secretary General of the Office of Spokesman, and he worked in the Department of the Arabic language, and he was in charge of many international missions in Pakistan, in Libya, Afghanistan, and he published so many books. The book about the destroying of the United Nations office in Baghdad 2003, and he finished just and published a research project on Arab situation like in Yemen, Syria, in partnership with the Arab Center. He received PhD in international relationship from New York University. In his intervention, Dr. Siyam will shed light on the relationship between the United Nations and the Palestinian crisis from historical background, and he will talk about the absence and absenteeism in the Palestinian situation. Dr. Siyam, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Dr. Aisha, for this introduction and my greetings to the audience. And in the outset, I would like to send my greeting to the great Palestinian people who are struggling and fighting back this annihilation war on behalf of the Arabic and Islamic world. In the beginning, I would like to tell you that I have spent my whole life working in the United Nations as an employee, a staff, and then I moved to teach and then go back to the United Nations as an accredited journalist. So everything I write about or lecture about the relationship on the relationship of the United Nations, international relations and crises, and hence I taught so many courses that has to do with the United Nations. In the beginning, I have prepared my paper to talk about the response from international community about the crises from on the but however, Dr. Aisha suggested that I focus on the Palestinian case and the United Nations over more than 76 years. Therefore, I would like to say that the Palestinian issue have went through 5 distinctive phases. The first phase, 1947 to 1952, which is the destruction of Palestine and the establishment of the occupation. And then the absenteeism phase from 1952 to 1973, the phase of active rise and historical decisions in the Arab sphere from 1974 to 1981, and the phase of the response or reaction when the war Arab became weaker and weaker, which is a 20 years phase, 1981 to 2003, and then the absenteeism phase from 2003 till present. Now I will go over every phase quickly. The first phase was the destruction and the partition decision, which Dr. Michael referred to on 29th of November, and the right of return resolution, which is on the 11th of December 1948, the resolution 1904, and also the resolution 302 about the Palestinian refugees, and in this resolution the funding of the UNRWA was left to the donation, and this is something very dangerous. No one paid attention to that back then, and the Arab delegations, when this resolution was adopted, there were 6 Arab delegations, all of them did not vote. They were in absenteeism because they were in abstention. And then the resolution 19, the decision of recognition of Israel, there 372 in 1949, and the resolution was that received a lot of criticism, and the representative of the Israeli government before the Special Political Committee also commented on the decision. Now, from the first minute, the Israelis started to violate the resolution, and in violation of the resolution 181, the Israel have decided to move the Knesset headquarters from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which is in a great violation of resolution 181, which considered Jerusalem as the corpus separatum, an entity that is supervised and managed by the United Nations through the Custody Council, and the Israeli government. So these decisions were against the General Assembly, but the United Nations never took an action. So the Israeli president have and also the Jerusalem have been called the capital of Israel on the 23rd of November Now, the second phase from 1952 to 1973, the Palestinian situation became absent. The United Nations stopped talking about Palestine and start discussing the Palestinian refugee issue. In this period, and in the light of the Arab defeat, in this phase, the most dangerous resolution was adopted after the defeat of 1967, which is the Resolution 242, which ignored Palestine at all, and they talked only about the right of refugees and the right of return. And that also led to the gift to the occupation with the Resolution 338 after the war, October War 1973. So the focus from then became about the refugees and their situations. In that period, Jerusalem was a very sensitive issue, especially for the Muslims, and I would like to refer to the Resolution 271 post the burning of the Aqsa Mosque, and where a very important resolution was adopted, because this situation was very sensitive to the Arabs and Muslims, and 271 emphasized about the protection of Al-Haram al-Sharif and to stop all actions that try to change the status quo, and the Secretary Council have promised to go back and adopt further measures if Israel was in violation of this resolution. I would like to tell you that the Security Council in this resolution have expressed their concern about the damage that took place to the Masjid Al-Aqsa Mosque and Al-Haram Sharif, and also the United Nations and the Special Envoy, when they mention Al-Haram Sharif, they use slash and they say the Aicha Temple, or that was not in the language, is the United Nations language, but it was dictated by the Secretary General envoys in Palestine. Now we talk about the third phase, which is the phase of rise, and from 1973 to 1981, the Arab group became in the United Nations, became one of the strongest groups in the United Nations. Egypt, Syria, Algeria, Kuwait, and Kuwait, they had a Palestinian representative work under the umbrella of Kuwait, which is Faiz al-Sayegh. He is very famous, of course, along with Iraq, and also the Alliance Conference was organized in Algeria in 1977, and then moved to Al-Ribat, the Arab Summit in 1974. We have recognized the Liberation Palestinian Liberation Organization as the sole representative of the Palestinian people. And when Abdelaziz Bouteflika was elected the president of the General Assembly in its 29th session in 1974, and the Arabs felt that they need to cut all connection. And in that phase, Arab language was introduced as a sixth language in the United Nations, and Resolution 3236 was adopted on 22nd of November 1974, which is the most important decision historically on the Palestinian people rights, because it have classified the rights of the Palestinian people that cannot be touched, untouchable, which has to do with his right to self-determination and independence and right of sovereignty, and the return of the Palestinians to their homes, and the right to select or elect their leaders who representative, and their right to fight back the occupation with suitable ways, in coordination, of course, with the United Nations, so give legitimacy to resistance. So this is also used in Namibia against, in South Africa also, they have adopted the same text which is fighting back the occupation in the suitable ways. And Yasser Arafat have addressed the packed room of representative, and he was treated like a head of a state. And the same room was backed when the American ambassador was assassinated. So the world was witnessing some change. But Yasser Arafat back then, he was received in a way that none other leader was received with. Following that, there was the resolution 3237, which gave the Palestinian Liberation Organization a fourth seat in the United Nations. The General Assembly in that time have established the Special Committee on the Palestinian right, and they have started and the Palestinian Liberation Organization gave an observatory status in the General Assembly, and the United Nations Conference also have established a special department about raising awareness about the situation, the Palestinian situation. Now let's talk about the historical resolution which adapted in that phase, the resolution of 1975, which is resolution 3379, which considered the Zionism part of apartheid, and that hit the Zionism doctrine in the heart, and they have decided to put all the resources to abolish this resolution, and they succeeded in 1991, 72 vote against 32 abstention, and Dr. Faiz Saigh have delivered a speech which was very convincing. Haim Herzog was the Israeli ambassador in the United Nations. He took the decision and stood before people, and he said, we will handle it like this way, and he tearing it apart and threw it on the face of the audience. This resolution was cancelled in 1991 when Shamir have introduced 3 terms to attend Madrid meeting. First, the Palestinian delegation comes within the Jordanian delegation, and the participant will come through the Palestinian occupied territories, and to cancel that resolution we have referred about the Zionism. And then George Bush himself, he went to the podium and presented this resolution to cancel the previous resolution. 111 countries voted with, 25 against, and 13 were in absentia. And Morocco, Egypt, Tunisia, Bahrain, and Oman, they didn't attend. In this period,
so during this period, the UN Security Council took some very important historical decisions, most importantly about the legitimacy of settlements, 466 and 452, and 2 historical decisions on Jerusalem, 476 that Professor Michael spoke about, and resolution 465, which required all the countries that have consulates or embassies in Jerusalem to withdraw them. There was one, Costa Rica, and it withdrew it, and resolution 465 that condemned the expulsion of the governors of Al-Khalil and Halhul, and resolution 471 that condemns the attempts against the lives of mayors. Now we move to the 4th phase, which is the reaction phase. During this phase, so the Arabs were not united. There was the Kuwait invasion, there was the Iran-Iraq war, also, so people were divided, there was the Oslo process. So during this period, we saw the Arabs not forming a consolidated front, and the Arab group became weak, and many Arab ambassadors were not talking to one another. So the events started dragging this group to the Security Council and not vice versa. A group of ambassadors led by Palestine, Ambassador Zohda Tarazi or Nasser Al-Qudwa, followed by Dr. Mansour, would go to the Security Council through the Arab member of the SC in order to file a complaint regarding what's happening. So it was during this phase that Resolution 521 was adopted about the Sabra and Shatila massacre, Resolution 572 regarding the aggression on the UN office in Tunisia, Resolution 605 about the expulsion of 400 Palestinians to Marj al-Zuhur in Lebanon, Resolution 605 that condemns the use of excessive force in the Intifada, Resolution 611 condemning the killing of Khalil al-Wazir Abu Jihad and violation of the sovereignty of Tunisia, and Resolution 904 after the Khalil massacre that asked for the protection of the Palestinian people. So they still mention it until today, Resolution 904. Last but not least, the US adopted 1397 and 1515 in 2002 and 3 on the two-state solution. It was giving promises to the Arabs of establishing two-state solution, and it formed a quartet in order to implement those two decisions. I'm going to finish 5 minutes. So now to the fifth phase, the forced absence or suppression. After the second war in Iraq, the Arabs were weakened. There was a lot of Palestinian divisions and Arab Spring revolutions. Since 2002 until today, 2 resolutions have been adopted only. The one mentioned by Dr. Michael, 1860 and 2334 in 2016 regarding halting the settlements. That is what was very personal to Obama, that wanted to deal a blow to Netanyahu after his Congress speech, so he allowed the resolution to pass. In 2011, the U.S. under Obama used the sole veto against a Saudi draft to stop settlements, and in 2017 Nikki Haley, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, used the veto right under Trump against a decision to refuse what Trump mentioned regarding recognizing Jerusalem as the consolidated and eternal capital of Israel. So 14 countries voted with this decision, and then what is vetoed by Nikki Haley. Nikki Haley then submitted a resolution to adopt the deal of the century, and it only got 2 votes, and it was such a big scandal against the policy of the United States back then. There are also key international resolutions by ad hoc agencies. The UNESCO took an important resolution in order to have Palestine as a full-fledged member to the UNESCO. It was the very first agency to do so with Palestine in 5 November 2011, and it was supported by 107 countries, opposed by 14, with 52 abstentions, all from the EU, Eastern Europe, and some Latin American countries. In 2016, there was another resolution adopted considering Al-Quds, the Aqsa Mosque, as purely Islamic endowment or waqf property, which has caused the anger of Israel and the U.S. A similar decision was adopted about Jericho, Bethlehem, Khalil, etc. The International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion on the 9th of July 2004 about the illegitimacy of the wall and the need to dismantle it and to redress the tort and compensate those affected. The Human Rights Council took a number of decisions and established a permanent committee after the Saif al-Quds, or the Jerusalem Sword Battle 2021, in order to investigate the violations of human rights in Palestine and Israel for the very first time. They were talking about the Arabs inside of Israel. And this led to a very important report in 2021 and 2022. And the current ambassador tore it down and threw it on those present, like in 75. Last but not least, the United Nations have disappointed the Palestinian people because there were resolutions taken but not implemented. They failed to take a number of resolutions. They failed to establish the Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. It failed in stopping settlements. Despite the resolutions, it failed in preventing the building of the wall. It failed in implementing the very important Jerusalem-related resolutions, preventing the destruction of houses and confiscation of land, also regarding the arrest of children and even holding them accountable and prosecuting them in military courts, and also condemning crimes of war and crimes against humanity in this continuous war. It failed to finance the UNRWA to be able to plan and implement its own works and activities based on a very clear budget. It also failed to give the dossier of prisoners any importance. It's not even mentioned in international reports. It also failed to retrieve Palestinian bodies held by the Zionist entity and the implementation of its resolution, starting with the division resolution until 2234 of 2016. So we do not find it strange to see this very shameful position of what's going on in Gaza. Thank you, Dr. Abdelhamid, for presenting us with all these very well-known and confirmed facts. This huge failure by the United Nations and the implementation of its own resolutions regarding the Palestinian cause. Now we give the floor to a third speaker, Dr. Ghassan ElKahlout, who is the director of the Center of Conflict Resolution and the Arab Center, and he is part of the master's program in our Doha Institute. He has a PhD in rebuilding after the war from York University in the UK. In his research and teaching work, he focuses on reconstruction after a war, especially in the Arab countries. He's worked in humanitarian and international organizations with a number of peer-reviewed papers. And he has two books issued by the Arab Center: Humanitarian Work, Reality and Challenges, and another one he edited, which is Forced Migration in Arab Countries. He is going to present to us an assessment of the UN responsiveness to the aggression in Gaza. I would like to specifically thank Dr. Ghassan, who was keen on participating in the seminar despite the hardship he is going through because his family is in Gaza. Thank you, Dr. Ghassan. We are unable to hear Dr. Ghassan. We cannot hear Dr. Ghassan, unfortunately. Yes. The mic is too far. It's too far. I cannot hear. Let him get closer to the mic, please. So there's not much I can add after what Dr. Abdelhamid has mentioned. It is a journey of failure for more than 75 years, be it politically, be it at the level of the protection of the Palestinian people, the humanitarian response. The failure continues. And maybe in the last few days, we've seen the UN Secretary General just speaking as a regular employee despite his big status and his impact. We all know how influential he can be and to stop the crimes against the Palestinian people. But to abide by the presentation time, allow me to say what I have, especially that I'm trying to answer some questions that I get a lot, be it from my colleagues, be it from my students, and to also clarify a few concepts. Sometimes there could be some harshness in the way the humanitarian staff is treated. They are accused of failing to protect the Palestinian civilians, failure to undertake tasks that we think they can do. We were meeting with the High Commissioner for Refugees a few days ago, and the questions were related to the fact that you failed, you didn't do anything for the Palestinian refugees. We're talking about the UNHCR, even though it's not related to the Palestinians solely. I have to clarify a few facts. If I want to speak about the UN response, political or humanitarian response by the UN in Gaza and the latest aggression. I would consider a number of questions that I will attempt to answer. Our history with the UN regarding the Palestinian cause started with the inception of the UN, and it is the most preoccupying issue, with the most dramatic start in 1947, as Dr. Abdelhamid has mentioned, regarding the division which was issued by the UN to divide Palestine into two states. And then 1948, the migration happened, and then there was the establishment of the UNRWA, where dealing with the Palestinians had nothing to do with the fact that it is a political cause. So many Palestinians were going to be introduced into certain programs like Cash for Work to help open infrastructure and road networks in the host countries. That was the very beginning of the Palestinian cause and the beginning of this loss of the idea of the Palestinian state. It was all legitimized through the UN resolutions. But now, if we are to talk about humanitarian work, what is expected from humanitarian assistance workers, be it the United Nations or the international humanitarian system or ecosystem? The noble objective of those working in humanitarian assistance is to protect the lives and the dignity of people. So as to achieve this, to preserve people's lives and dignity and humanity, we have to prevent them from being hungry, thirsty, provide them with all the necessary services, prevent them from feeling cold, providing them with the necessary and dignified place to stay in or accommodation. We're talking here about this being part of the duties of the international community as per the international conventions and treaties. This is first. This is what we expect from humanitarian assistance and work, and also the issue of this of separating between the civilians and the military. Civilians ought to be protected by those working in the humanitarian field. A second issue I'd like to clarify: who are humanitarian workers? Those working in the humanitarian field are not people who ask to become martyrs. They are employees who have certain certificates, certain licenses, etc., and they are looking for a job opportunity. They are well paid, decent perks, and this is a good opportunity for them to act in the community. But they are not required to die because they chose humanitarian work. Humanitarian workers in Gaza right now are not going to die because of the Palestinian people. They are also required not to move, not to take any action during times of war. I communicated with some UN colleagues from the UNRWA, and they told me if we were working as international workers in Gaza, the UNHCR would have asked us to evacuate. This is not something to be discussed. So this explains to us the UN conduct as we speak about it right now. So this is what is expected of them. A UN staffer is not going to endanger themselves because these are the orders of its institution. This doesn't only apply to the UN, but also to other international humanitarian organizations. Another question, the international humanitarian ecosystem. We're not talking here about only about the UN agencies. There are also international humanitarian organizations, civil society organizations, Oxfam, Save the Children, etc. There's also the International Red Cross, the ICRC. They each have a mandate that governs their work, but most of them has the same applying to them. We're talking about safety and security protocols applying to them. They cannot work in times of war. These are the instructions that they're given. Now, regarding the United Nations, there is always confusion between those staffers working on the ground and the political decision. This was also raised in the discussion we had with the UNRWA 2 days ago. There was one question to the Vice Commissioner or Deputy Commissioner. She was told, if you cannot do your job regarding the refugees, you have to resign. She said, I cannot do much. The UN, at the end of the day, has its members. Those members are governments represented there. And the United Nations, anyway, is divided into different departments, including ad hoc and specialized agencies that come under specific departments or units in the United Nations. But the biggest power in the United Nations is the Security Council. So if there were no decisions taken by the UN Security Council, even Resolution 194 for the right of return to Palestinians is not as binding as the Security Council itself. If we look at the history of the Security Council, it's a long history of failure and disappointment regarding Palestine. The United Nations and Security Council failed to provide a protection for the Palestinian people, to provide them with safe passageways, corridors, or any of the options that we can consider when we speak about humanitarian work. This was the point that I wanted to clarify first. The organizations working, such as the UNRWA, the UNESCO, the UNICEF, the UNFPA, all these different agencies are unable to implement, as mentioned Dr. Abdelhamid, because they have financing and budgeting issues. They rely on governments to be funded. So if they took the initiative and they had a Secretary General that's very active in support of the Palestinian people, but there's no political decision, there's nothing he can do. So they constantly need political decisions, and this is customary. Now to speak about working in times of war. Humanitarian work. In an environment of war, armed conflict, or others, it's not going to be easy for the different agencies. For example, if we take the situation in Gaza, we're going to say there's continuous bombardment, destruction of infrastructure, lack of roads, shortage of warehouses that have been destroyed, also UN facilities and premises that have been destroyed. So all these are difficulties that within 20 days indicate that working in such a context could be almost impossible. It's just not possible to work in such a context, especially with the continuous bombing, this relentless bombarding. Now, regarding the United Nations and Palestine, maybe to try to highlight one good point about the work of the UN in Palestine. The UNRWA, as we mentioned, was dealing with the Palestinian issue as a humanitarian issue. But the UNRWA is doing its job since 1947 in Gaza and the West Bank and Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. And it undertakes a number of missions. Its staff number is around 30,000. Some call it the blue state because it's related to the United Nations, this big infrastructure and large number of employees and big bureaucracy that exists in the UNRWA as part of the UN. I may pretend to have been born in a clinic under the UNRWA, played in clubs that are hosted by the UNRWA, and I've even gotten my first degree upon the sponsorship of the UNRWA. Such was the role of the UNRWA in my life. Only my BA, not my MA or PhD. But that was the impact of the UNRWA on the different refugees in Gaza and the West Bank and in different areas. I think, to be fair with the UNRWA, we have to say that it has greatly helped with the Palestinians resisting and surviving. The Palestinian people of 1948 are not the same as the Palestinians in 2023. The UNRWA played a big role therein. The UNRWA played an equally big role when it comes to advocating for the people of Palestine and the Palestinian rights. However, there are a lot of criticism by the Palestinians and others regarding the work of the UNRWA. The other side, they want to end the sources of the UNRWA by putting an end to the Palestinian cause, while the Palestinians criticize the UNRWA because it doesn't have enough, because it relies on contributions, not a clear budget, as Dr. Abdelhamid has mentioned, and they had a big issue So this was a light in the journey of the UNRWA with Palestine, as I mentioned. So healthcare, caring for the poor, a large number of loans for startup businesses, all financed by the UNRWA in different phases. Now, in the latest aggression against Gaza, the UNRWA says that it lost 35 of its employees, 18 were injured, 2 of its facilities were affected, 40 facilities were almost destroyed, and the humanitarian work. The UNRWA says that there is 600,000 internally displaced in its facilities, and 42,000 people internally displaced in 33 of its facilities and 57 of its facilities in North Gaza after the evacuation orders issued on 7th of October. Those refuges host much more than they can handle. The employees are still trying to serve people, but in such a restricted way due to the conditions on the ground. 89 units and mobile medical teams are providing care for people in the refuges. More than 50% of its medical centers are not working. In Jabalia, Khan Yunis, and Rafah, their water facilities are still operational, and there is a water transportation trucks. So what can the UN do? As you see, the UN and all its governments have been greatly mobilized against the Palestinian people. The UN resources in this case, if I'm going to speak about technical experts, those working on the ground, I think they are very restricted in terms of their margin of maneuver. It is a political decision, and the political decision is by the Security Council, and the veto continues. So there should be a political decision to provide protection to the Palestinian people. Usually, the UN may facilitate a ceasefire, halting the aggression or the hostilities, humanitarian pauses, days of calm, a humanitarian passage or corridor. So there could be a humanitarian diplomacy that the UN can promote, and the UN may work towards that. But even in these humanitarian corridors, there should be an approval, of course, by the conflicting parties or the warring parties. And as you know, Israel is totally refusing that. Yesterday, the spokesperson of the occupation said that if they want them to approve of that, they are requiring the surrender of all the Hamas people, the liberation of all the hostages, etc. So these are the terms that they are imposing to approve a humanitarian pause. Dr. Abdelhamid spoke about the UN Security Council resolutions, but I have a statistic here. I'm not going to be very lengthy, Dr. Aicha. So, between 1967 and 2019, there's 164 vetoes issued in the Security Council. 81 of which by the United States, 81 by the UK, 44 for the protection of Israel from being held responsible and accountable before Security Council. So there's not going to be any exception. The mobilization is even greater today. So the UN has truly failed to provide protection, to deliver humanitarian assistance. The role of the UN Secretary General was dwarfed. He couldn't speak before a passageway, knowing that he was unable to reach the people who were just a few steps away. So the UN doesn't play a political role. It is waiting a decision by the US. So the UN decision is dictated by the US political will. Now for the outlook, future outlook. All this post-World War system with having 5 big powers with veto powers and the Security Council means that there is no hope for this international humanitarian ecosystem to help those who need it. Last thing I'm going to mention, it's not only about the Palestinian people. Maybe there's a lot of highlight on the Palestinian people because it is only related to Israel, the state of Israel. But there's a lot of death in our Arab region. And we remember how the United Nations didn't do much in the northwest Syria during the earthquake, and more than a 6-day delay. There wasn't much coverage as it is the case with the Palestinian people. Not that the Palestinian people are an elite, just because that there's Israel in the issue. Otherwise, nobody would have cared. Our blood is being shed. So there were a lot of issues all around the Arab world. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, for sharing with us your experience. Now we will give the floor for Q&A. We have around 40 minutes. We will open the floor for a question.
Kindly introduce yourself.
The question to you, first I want to thank you for the, the terminology force of power and force of legal. In terms of resistance, the definition of freedom fighter or resistance in the United Nations, at what we see now, the resistance definition have been changed, and the resistance is being on a settler land, so it's an occupied land. So that the definition of that terminology. What is similar resistance than the Palestinian resistance or Hamas that has been, like a similar resistance that been perceived or been cornered like a similar situation. Another thing is on hostage, as Hamas called them hostage, and guest, and also on double nationalities, on fighting an army, like what you see in Israeli armies, you see people with dual citizenship. You know, they are fighting as an Israeli, but they have an American passport or other dual citizenship. So what is the definition that in another question لحق الدكتور صيام سريع يعني تكلمت عن جورج بوش في إلغاء قرارين في الأمم المتحدة. ماذا إذا تم هل السلطة الفلسطينية أو تبعياته القانونية في إلغاء مثلا عملية أوسلو 30 سنة وفشلت، شنو تبعاتها أو عكسها مثلا؟
Thank you. دكتور محمد شرقاوي. اسمي محمد شرقاوي وأنا أدرس
diplomacy, and I served on the UN panel of experts I would like to go to an insightful point, Professor Lynk, you made early at the beginning about this duality of the paradigm of power versus the paradigm of justice. And as Dr. Siyam has showcased, this is exactly this duality that explains why this past 76 years, we have a normative approach at the UN, we have decision making, we have a debate, we have a vote system. Unfortunately, it stops there. It does not get implemented. Not only that, I think you have summarized eloquently the big difference between the Security Council as a driver of power politics versus the General Assembly, UNESCO, UNICEF, and other UN agencies that tend to solidify the normative approach, which is the justice versus an injustice. So I think it's about time, after 76 years, we wake up and we drink some good coffee and ask ourselves as audiences, as public opinions, as people who believe we still have some humane and humanitarian norms. Should we follow the same normative approach by awaiting a normative wake-up call within the Security Council? And we know the asymmetry of power between the Council and the General Assembly. Or is it probably a better approach to adopt a real politic approach toward the Security Council itself? This is the center of the decision-making power. So my question to you, Professor Lynk, should we wait for a UN reform? That means we need to wait for a moment when the US either can no longer use its veto, or there is another system that challenges the US veto itself, or you think there is maybe another point of entry in deconstructing the US power of veto and also deconstructing the whole dynamic of the Security Council. So where is the egg, where is the chicken here in this duality of power and justice? Thank you.
تفضلي السيدة. The lady.
Okay, it's Lino. I'm gonna introduce myself as a Gazan refugee, and don't ask me why I'm registered as Gaza refugee. It's like they choose, actually they classified me as a refugee. And I'm also a 5 Israeli attack survivor. I'm also living this war, even if I'm not living this war physically, but I'm living it emotionally with my people, with the 2.3 million people in Gaza. It's because they somehow, all of them relate to me. So now I just seek a very simple answer, since the United Nations, like the UN security, cannot stop the aggression against Gaza. Like United Nations cannot implement its resolutions and cannot do anything about the aggression against Gaza. And the humanitarian aids cannot be provided to people because it's simply risky for people to provide humanitarian aids to people in Gaza. So now, I think we have reached a conclusion that you want us to leave people in Gaza to die? That's actually the thing that we can do now. Since you cannot stop the aggression, you cannot stop the suffering and the killing of people in Gaza, you cannot provide humanitarian aid to people in Gaza. So what do you want us to do? To wait till our families, our friends, our people to die? Do you want us to wait till 2.3 million Gazans, again, 2.3 million Gazans to die till you make an action? This is the question. It's either yes or no. Thank you.
Thank you. هناخد السؤال من هنا. سنعود
Some see that the United Nations has totally succeeded. It hasn't failed. Because the UN, as some see it, is an international system to control, to dominate. What has it done with us regarding the Palestinian cause? They welcomed us officially, etc. the generation that is making a miracle happen is not a UN generation. It's a generation that imposes itself on the reality. So the UN, in my opinion, has greatly succeeded in diluting the cause. My question to Professor Lynk regarding the Western leaders' position vis-à-vis this cause, like Trudeau, for example, that they don't see the Zionist crimes. They speak about tricks. The UK Prime Minister is talking about the likely party to have bombed the
It looks like هذا عبارات معيبة ومشينة.
So these are shameful terms. I think what's happening in Gaza is not only a liberation of the Palestinians, of the Muslims, of the Arabs, but also a liberation of the West, the Western people, to break this domination, this one-sided approach, this contemptuous way of dealing with others, this disdainous way of dealing with others, which we see in the West happening, especially with the rise of the right-wing extremists. Thank you. My name is Saif al-Islam Eid from the Arab Center. It's a very simplified question. All this is happening amidst the presence of the United Nations. What's the use of having the United Nations if it weren't for the United Nations to prevent the blockade, the continuous blockade for years against the Palestinian people? What are the efforts made by the UN to end the blockade? Zero. Nothing has been done by United Nations to end the efforts and the hardship of all Arabs, not only Palestinian. So as the emerging generation that sees the fake news, we've lost the speaker. This propaganda machine, there seems to be a conspiracy against me. So why should we believe the United Nations with anything? So what is the main point of having the United Nations? لنجب عن هذه الجولة الأولى من الأسئلة.
All very astute questions, and some of the questions are going to exceed my capacity for being able to answer them, but let me try them as best I can. The first questions came from something I've been asked over and over again, and I think these are questions that that go to the issue of the right to resist. I think is at the very core of what you're saying, and how do they apply to a non-international actor like Hamas, and what does it say with respect to issues of hostage taking or taking of those with double nationality who may be in a uniform, maybe out of a uniform, as I understood the range of your questions. So there's several different questions there. Let me see if I can efficiently answer what you've raised. International humanitarian law says that in times of conflict, that the general rules about distinguishing between civilians and combatants applies whether you're an international actor, a state, a formal military with an army, or you're a non-state actor, such as Hamas or a range of other groups that are fighting for or against a particular issue. All of this would apply to Hamas with respect to its treatment. You know, of the 1,400 who were apparently killed, if the figures are accurate, on October 7th and perhaps into October 8th, I understand that somewhere in the range of 300 to 400 may have been soldiers in uniform, Israeli soldiers in uniform. The rest would have been civilians. A soldier out of uniform, a combatant out of uniform in civilian uniform without a gun is a civilian. And that's the way he or she would be treated in international law. For the roughly 1,000, if the figures are to be believed, of Israeli civilians who were killed, those deaths would quite likely amount to war crime for which there should be accountability under our rules of IHL. With respect to hostages, it's quite clear that civilians are not to be used as hostages or wind up being captured, and that applies to those who may have. Let me finish, and then you can add those who may have double nationality. If they're civilians, whatever nationality they are protected. If they have gone to serve in the Israeli army, but at the time of the particular conflict or incident or event were not in uniform and not with a gun, then they're not soldiers, they're civilians with respect to this. Please, why don't you, someone, microphone?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I see 1,000 settlers. They are in my village. That one generation it's gone there. My father is telling me, this is your village. The responsibility goes to the Israeli governments who gave them land, build it, or to me, trying to fight, because I really think that, in my understanding, if they are an Israeli state,
They're legitimate
different,
targets.
but if they are settlers in my land,
Yeah.
that's what.
That's your point. Well,
Yeah.
let me make the point even more acutely. There are 700,000 or more Israeli settlers in East Jerusalem and the West Bank today. The people you were talking about who were killed were predominantly Israeli citizens in what at least juridically is known today as Israel. Israeli settlers in the West Bank. Their presence is illegal. Their settlements are illegal, a flagrant violation under international law. Nonetheless, as civilians who are not combatants, I'm an Israeli civilian settler driving my car from one settlement to another without a weapon. I am a civilian. I am protected, even though I am living illegally under somebody else's land. That would be the rules of international humanitarian law. That changes if I'm traveling with a gun. I may be attacked, but if I have a gun, then I transform into then I probably transform into a combatant in shooting back. So it's always important to make this absolute distinction between civilian and combatant, even though you may be living as a settler colonial person in a particular state that is 15 minutes away from the millions who are in Gaza who know that land was there 75 years ago, or those who know that the settlement was built on the ruins or the expropriation of my village 5 minutes away from my village. They are settlers, but they are civilians, unless they are armed and engaged in an attack. So that's the distinction that law winds up driving. But your questions are very good. It's important to try to make sure that we understand those distinctions with respect to that. The second question I have, and I'll try to be very efficient in answering these, has to do with the duality of power that you've mentioned. I've mentioned as well, and you thought that this helped explain the difference between the Security Council in particular on one hand and the UN General Assembly and the various UN agencies, particularly those that serve the Palestinians, like the International Labour Organization, or UNICEF, or UNESCO, or the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. So we ask ourselves, we understand the issue about human dignity. We ask ourselves with respect to the asymmetry of power. And you ask whether or not there should be a realpolitik approach towards the Security Council. I think what we know the difficulty, the extreme challenge in trying to reform the Security Council, because we know it's been the blockage of many worthwhile initiatives, and particularly because of the power of the Permanent Five not wanting to give up their veto. But are there things we can wind up doing to try to change that in some way? Can it be that we at least change the Constitution or the rules of procedure with respect to the Security Council to insist that there can no longer be a single veto that kills it? It at least has to be 2 permanent members that would have to change it. Or in a process that's already happening, if there is a veto at the Security Council, then the issue goes to the General Assembly, and I believe this week there are going to be meetings, special emergency meetings at the General Assembly that are going to take up the question that the Security Council failed to endorse, i.e. a ceasefire in the Israeli assault on Gaza. So there are mechanisms, maybe moving too slowly, maybe being far too cautious, but there are mechanisms of change that are trying to curb some of this extreme power that the Security Council has had. And I think it's up to us, as particularly the responsibility of intellectuals, as Edward Said would say, to try to bring these kinds of issues to the forefront so that we know where change has to come from. A third question came from the United Nations trying to stop the aggression against Gaza and leaving people to, obviously, are dying in the thousands with respect to that. What I can point to, I heard this comment the other day by a comedian who said it with all seriousness and in the way only a Palestinian comedian can say, that I'm sorry to have been born Palestinian, which was meant obviously in irony. We do have, too slowly and too inefficiently, but we do have mechanisms at the international stage in the forms of the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. The International Criminal Court was created 25 years ago by the Statute of Rome, now existing in The Hague, has had complaints in front of it since January 2015. You may argue, and I would not argue with you, that these have been far too slow. They've sat for a long period of time in the office of the Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, and they've gone further in the on the back burner because of the Special Prosecutor wanting to put current attention on Ukraine. Again, public voices. Never underestimate the power of public voices and the ability of intellectuals to be able to critique the world as it is and to say to the prosecutor, because he has been receiving a number of letters initiated by civil society saying, put Palestine back on the front burner where it belongs. You already have a mass of investigation files in front of you that have proven substantially that Israel has committed war crimes. The most obvious one being the settlements. The settlements are pure and simple, a gross violation of Article 8 of the Rome Statute. And this is also in the legislation of many countries. And if the ICC won't move fast enough, then national jurisdiction, universal jurisdiction, should force those countries, particularly in Europe and countries like mine in Canada, to take that up and to say, we have alternative zones of justice and courts that will be able to address these kinds of questions. I think if I can leave it for others to answer the other questions.
Thank you, Dr. Abdelhamid.
Hamid, I will be answering 2 questions in brief. The first one, what would happen if Oslo agreement was cancelled? Then the responsibility of the occupied territory will go to the occupying force. Oslo should have been cancelled in 1999 when all the deadlines was the independent Palestine with its capital, whether they like it or not, they should have announced that in 1999. There were no independent country. On the contrary, the occupation continued, the settlement continued, the storming in continued, the building of the apartheid wall continued. Oslo should have been cancelled in 1999. Every time the Palestinian Authority threatened, we will cancel the Oslo, we will cancel the security coordination, but they keep doing nothing. So Oslo have proven that is a big failure. It does not it's not doing anything for the sake of the Palestinian. The second question, why do we need the United Nations? We still need the United. We should not look to the United Nations as a one package, whether it's good or bad. The United Nations is a system, a big system. There are failures in one issues, but success in others. But it is based on pillars. The first one is the international safety and security, where there is a huge failure. The second pillar is the human rights, and there is also some achievement in the special in legislations, the agreements on human rights, the Aboriginal rights, the women rights, rights of migrants, the children rights, so many conventions and agreements that become a culture for human rights. So this is a big achievement. The third pillar, which is development, there are organizations that have achieved so much. The WHO achieved so much. The UNESCO is very critical in international heritage and protection of it. So also other agencies have raised awareness of the whole world about climate change, the WFP, the International Food Program that feed more than 86 million people around the world. The people are waiting for all the humanitarian assistance from the AFP, and also the UNHCR. Also, they play a very critical role. And the UNICEF, all of them, they all have roles and they have successes, they have failures. However, the biggest failure is in the peace and security, international peace and security, represented by the Security Council and the General Assembly. The General Assembly have played a big role in the absence of the Security Council in the Suez problem in 1956. The General Assembly is the one who exerted all the efforts to sort this problem, the peace process and the ceasefire. The General Assembly was behind it in the absence of the Security Council, and sometimes also they are the one who transferred the wall to the ICC, and now they have transferred the occupation case, and now in March and April there will be some kind of and Dr. Michael Lynk is one of those lawyers who will be in the court when they discuss the matter of the occupation. Thank you, Dr. Abdelhamid Siyam. Now we'll give the floor for another set of questions.
My question is for Dr. Michael Lynk. More than 800 experts in genocide studies around the world have issued a statement warning that the Israeli aggression on Gaza constitutes a genocide. What do you think about this warning?
مرحبا. أولاً شكراً.
Like first, my name is Amal. I would like to thank everyone. I would like to tell you that all the achievement of the United Nations has never have a positive on the Palestinian. My question is for Mr. Michael. Please correct me, Mr. Michael. As I have heard, Israel, any citizen in Israel that is over 16 years old is classified as a soldier, and he is summoned in case of emergencies, a reserve. Everyone are talking about 1,400 killed and the hostages, but in comparison to 5,000 civilians who were annihilated, killed in Gaza. So the question is the resistance, I will not say Hamas because of its political sensitivity, is the resistance, they are not entitled, they are not allowed to defend their countries and take hostages of citizens that is classified by Israel as soldiers in comparison with an genocide for the whole people in Gaza. Is this why the double standard? Why Israel can kill that number of civilians while the resistance have no right to kill who are classified as soldiers? Thank you, Dr. Michael. Another question.
I'm a research assistant in CHS. My question is, it revolves around the UNRWA. And I mean, Dr. Ghassan highlighted all the positive aspects of UNRWA and how nice they were to us as Palestinian refugees. I'm a Palestinian refugee myself. I was born and raised in one of the refugee camps in Lebanon. And I have seen how degrading the UNRWA workers have been treating the Palestinian refugees. And I want to just ask about the premise of Palestinians believe that when the PLO was strong, UNRWA was working for the Palestinian refugees and for their benefits. And it's evident because now UNRWA is no longer as serving the Palestinians the way it was during the when the PLO was strong. That's before the 1982. And this is also evident in the way the workers themselves treat the Palestinian refugees, the local ones, like in a very degrading manner. They don't listen to what they actually want. At least this is my experience in the refugee camps of Lebanon. So this is yes. So this is my question for Dr. Ghassan regarding how, when the Palestinians were strong enough, they were able to influence how the UNRWA was treating the Palestinians and serve the Palestinians in a positive way. Thank you.
تفضل دكتور أستاذ معن.
فقط توضيح يعني بتردد انه قتل 1400 او 1200 مدني اسرائيلي. هذا العدد غير مؤكد، هذا العدد بتحكي مصادر اسرائيليه ومصادر رسميه اسرائيليه، ما في تحقيق او ما في روايه.
A reliable story that confirmed that on the 7th of October this number has been killed, 1200 or 1400. I don't know the real number, but who confirms that this is the real number? Maybe they are more, maybe they are less, but we would like to be very cautious when we repeat numbers announced by the Israeli government. They lied when they talked about the beheading of children and rape of women, and I'm very sure they might have lied about the number 1400. How? So we don't know for sure how many Israeli civilians were killed on the 7th of October. Thank you. My question was for Dr. Abdelhamid regarding the United Nations. What is the value of voting when there is a veto, and how can we improve the policies of the United Nations to keep the global system? Because now the whole world is trying to lose confidence in the United Nations. How can we then? So this is all what we can receive from the question due to time limitation. Dr. Mike, would you like to be the first one to answer the question?
Let me address the question on genocide very briefly. You've mentioned that there's a statement that's been signed by over 800 scholars around the world with respect to raising the issue of genocide. I'm one of those scholars who signed it. And I'm proud to do so, and there are a number of scholars who I highly admire who know more about the issue of genocide than I do, who've affixed their names with respect to that. Let me be very, very efficient in trying to answer this. Genocide is perhaps the crime of crimes. It was codified in international law through the United Nations in the Genocide Convention of 1948. It's included in the Rome Statute. What it requires is both acts of genocide and intents of genocide. Two features, and these are common to any domestic criminal system as well, what we call mens rea and actus reus. You have to have the intent to commit a crime, and you actually go forth and commit the action of committing it. And those scholars have drawn from a number of statements just made in the last 2 weeks or so by Israeli legal, political, and military leaders, including and starting from the Israeli president, who have made comments with respect to all Palestinians are guilty, Palestinians are animals. We intend to conduct our military operations in Gaza with destruction in mind, not with precision, and so on. So these give rise to the question of whether or not there is sufficient intent by Israel to commit genocide. Genocide is the destruction in whole or in part of the life and community and vibrance of a nation or a country or of an ethnicity. There are also numerous acts that have been cited. Whether or not this meets the very high standard needed to prove genocide, and we can think of recent instances over the last 100 years which have been classified as genocides: the Turkish genocide of the Armenians, the Hutu genocide of the Rwandans, obviously the European destruction of the Jews by the Germans. But keep this in mind. What we always need, and I know this is a difficult thing to say to Palestinians, but what we always need is a form of strategic patience. Let me give you one example. 5 or 6 years ago, as I was at the very beginning of my time as Special Rapporteur, the word apartheid would be occasionally used, particularly by Palestinian human rights groups. And it was often seen and often dismissed as a political slogan. Yes, there may be bad things happening to the Palestinians. Does it amount to apartheid? But in those 5 years, there were substantive, coherent, cohesive, and massive reports produced on the question of apartheid by Amnesty International, by Human Rights Watch, by El-Haq, by El-Mizan, by Bet Salem, by Yashtin, by myself as Special Rapporteur, such that in a very short, very rapid period of time, the term apartheid became part of the human rights language, universally endorsed by the human rights movement. This is what we need when it comes to genocide. Yes, there are actions that may appear to open the door with respect to genocidal thinking and even genocidal actions over the course of the last 2 weeks. What we require is the same kind of solid civil society effort to try to begin to explain the legal status of the question of genocide in law, in international law, and of beginning to document through comprehensive reports by human rights organizations on the question of genocide, so that in 3 years or 4 years, we now have, if you like, the solid intellectual foundations of being able to establish a strong argument on genocide. We are at the beginning of this because we are first opening up this question now in the last several weeks. I know that genocide has been used before, but generally without the kind of intellectual rigor that's required in law to be able to give it a firm anchor. Let's start that process now, and I hope that the statement by the 800, that's probably more than 800 scholars now with respect to genocide, is going to start that. That doesn't satisfy those of you who may say, it's genocide now, we need to find a court tomorrow. But believe me, the ability to be able to document injustice and to bring it to the kind of level of evidence that's needed in law, and then from law into diplomacy, sometimes always involves a particular journey. If we did it with apartheid over the last 5 years, we can do it with genocide as well.
Thank you.
How can we
آلية التصويت في الأمم المتحدة؟ ولأن هناك تصويتات عديدة، هناك في كثير من المنظمات
voting, there are so many organizations and agencies that do not have a veto. Therefore, the Human Rights Council have established more than one inquiry and investigation without a veto. However, the problem is with the Security Council. Until we change the system of voting, we need to change the structure of the Security Council, and that will require the expansion of the Security Council, introducing new members with a permanent status or non-permanent status. And until we do this, we need also to change the mandate, which is very hard. On the Article 110, if you read it, you will find the difficulty of changing the law. If we want to change it, we need to two-thirds voting, and permanent countries, they need to vote on their parliament, ratifying in their parliament, not only in the countries in Majlis, in the Security Council. This is what makes it difficult. But now there is a convention that the Security Council need to be expanded. But the Americans have their own vision of how the expansion should take place. They want Germany, India, other countries want Brazil, other countries want Nigeria. And there are countries who reject all of that. Pakistan do not want India to be permanent member. Italy doesn't want Germany to be permanent. So you can see the difficulty. So there's now disagreement between even regional groups. Some Latin American countries object that Brazil is to become the permanent member representing the Latin America. They don't even speak Spanish. They say, how can a country that does not speak Spanish represent a continent that every country speaks Spanish? So there's disagreements. However, the difficulty is on the General Security Council, and we don't see in the horizon a possibility to restructure, to change it, or even to change the voting process, for example, more than 2 vote, or these are all still up in the air. We don't see any horizons for such an achievement. Thank you, Dr. Hussam. Thank you very much. As I have said before, I tried to look a positive ending. I found that UNRWA, yes, they have contributed to the welfare of the Palestinian people, but I can never remember a day when they contributed to solving the Palestinian problem. Yes, they build the capacity of the Palestinians, they provide the support, financial. If the UNRWA left based on the demand of the US and Israel, who will fill their place, who will fill their shoes, in their shoes. We have organized a seminar about girls' education, and we have used one of the experts in Gaza to talk about this to our friends in Afghanistan about girls' education. So this gentleman was asked, what is the budget for the education? He said 80% of educating girls in Gaza comes from UNRWA. So this image that UNRWA have contributed in this in the Palestinian situation, many educators, many intellectuals, they were educated with the help of the UNRWA. So UNRWA is actually a light in maybe the only light in the history of Palestine after occupation. I can't hear the question. No one, the microphone. In international humanitarian law, and also when Mr. Waddah, when he talked about international humanitarian law with the settlement and the uniform and whether to treat them as combatant or as civilians. On Dr. Mike, this is, I think, again back to the civilians in Gaza. You already answered about the classification of civilians and combatant, but I think there, bring this back to the ending. We thank you very much for your presence and your engagement. We would like to thank again the speakers, Professor Michael Lynk, Professor Ghassan ElKahlout, and Professor Ghassan Siyam. Thank you very much.